Sam Seder, Emma Vigeland on the Majority Report. It is a pleasure to welcome back to the program Dr. Michael Mann, climatologist, geophysicist, and director of the Center for Science, Sustainability, and the Media at the University of Pennsylvania, co-author with Dr. Peter Hotez, professor of pediatrics and molecular virology and microbiology at Baylor College of Medicine. Their latest book, Science Under Siege, How to Fight the Five Most Powerful Forces That Threaten Our World. Professor, I know that Dr. Hotez may be joining us in a bit. It is great to see you again. We have had many conversations over the years about, in particular, I mean, both about climate change, but about specifically, I know you and I have had this conversation for quite some time about scientists' role in this sort of new world, which is now probably 10, 12, 14, 20 years old of dealing and mostly in the context of climate change, but the sort of the I guess the palette has extended to all sort of science in a broad stroke. To pushing back on this, tell us a little bit. You've written about the 5 Ps, but before we get there, just tell us about, like, over the course of your career, how the environment has changed. Not literally the environment, but the environment to talk about the environment.
Yeah, thanks, Sam. It's great to be back with you. And indeed, over the years, we've talked many times about climate disinformation and this concerted effort by bad actors to sort of cloud the public discourse to prevent us from taking the needed action. And, you know, it was sort of PTSD for me because the attacks on me, the attacks on climate science go back more than 2.5 decades, really. In my case, back to the late 1990s when we published the now well-known hockey stick curve that really laid bare the reality and threat of human-caused warming that made it a threat to fossil fuel interests and those promoting their agenda. And so for me, back about 5 years ago, it was PTSD to watch my friends, my colleagues in the public health space, Peter Hotez, my co-author, Tony Fauci, and others come under attack by folks, the very same folks using the same tactics, looking to discredit them and their science for ideological reasons. And so I reached out to Peter. I felt like we had lessons to provide to them. We became friends, and we decided we had a book to write here about, as you allude to, the sort of metastasization of what was once this sort of, to use a public health analogy, a localized cancer that is now metastasized to impact not just all of science or any areas of science that are policy relevant, but our fact-based discourse itself.
How much do you think this, I mean, it seems to me there's sort of like 2 different players who sort of cross over, at least in the genesis of this, because, and I only know this quote because it included in a book I wrote in 2006 from Gertrude Himmelfarb, who is Irving Kristol's, or was Irving Kristol's wife, Bill Kristol's mother.
Interesting.
She, in 2005, she was talking about the mechanistic and reductionist interpretation of all human life, including its emotional, intellectual dimensions, in the name of Darwinism. This is more than science, it's scientism. Scientism with a vengeance. Science that is now presumed to be the only access to comprehensive truth. They have been attacking in the conservative movement science for decades and decades, because this narrative ultimately helps them, whether it is we shouldn't have lead in the gasolines, we shouldn't pour mercury into our water. And so when climate change comes along, there's sort of almost like a pre-built mechanism to attack the science.
Absolutely. Yeah, there was a pre-existing playbook. It was the playbook that was used by, in all of these other cases you cite, was used by the gun lobby. Most famously and most relevantly, it was used by the tobacco industry. And there is a document, there is a line from the reports that the tobacco industry was forced to make public as part of a settlement with a number of states' attorneys general back in the 1990s. They were forced to preside over these internal documents, one of which I believe it was Brown and Williamson, but this applied to all of the tobacco companies, the tobacco industry. Doubt is our product. That's a line from the tobacco industry. And what they meant there was they need to sow doubt and confusion about what their own internal research actually validated. Their own internal research showed that their product was killing people. That was bad for their business model. And so they hid that from the public. The fossil fuel industry used exactly that same playbook. And in fact, there are now famously internal documents, ExxonMobil document from 1982, where their own scientists referred to the potential consequences of continued extraction and burning of fossil fuels as catastrophic. That wasn't Al Gore. That wasn't the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the UN. It was ExxonMobil's own scientists. And as we know, they came out with that report. ExxonMobil apologized and said they would do everything they could to. No, of course, we don't live in that universe, that alternative universe. No, they hid the report, and now we are bearing the brunt of that. If we had acted decades ago, we could have prevented a lot of the damage that we're now seeing. And Sam, you put your finger on something really important here, is, what joins these things together. And we can talk about, the lockdowns were a threat to the Koch brothers, the largest publicly held fossil fuel interest, and these libertarian funders of sort of the conservative echo chamber front groups and astroturf organizations and producers of misinformation and disinformation. So they had a specific reason to oppose climate action, but they also had a specific reason to oppose the public health messaging on COVID as the pandemic became, as the pandemic started up, because the lockdowns and stay-at-home orders, all of these things would, and they did, reduce fossil fuel usage, reduce transportation. They would slow down the economy. They would reduce demand for fossil fuels, and that would hurt their bottom line. And so they weaponized misinformation and disinformation to try to oppose those efforts. And ultimately, that rabble that they created, which was opposed to the messaging of public health scientists, would naturally become anti-vaxxers as well. And that was truly tragic. That, as Peter has pointed out, led to hundreds of thousands of unnecessary deaths here in the United States alone. But there's a larger thing here. And sorry, that's really what you put your finger on, which was a world without objective truth, a world without trusted messengers, a world without, science-based policymaking is a world where the bad actors run free. And that's what they want. And that's what they've been working towards for a number of decades. And that, scarily enough, is where we are now.
Yeah, I would add, too, that there was a paper written by Sam Bagenstos, who is a professor at University of Michigan, on a lot of the COVID era sort of subsidies. And they found that, the polling on these subsidies, actually, the value of these subsidies to people, at least as a political matter, was reduced dramatically because those same interests that you're talking about, fossil fuel or just big money, wanted people back at work. And so diminishing the subsidies and stigmatizing them and keeping people safe, which meant less engaged with things on a day-to-day measure, or you've got to put protections in, was just not in their economic interests.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
Let's turn to the 5 Ps that you talk about, just to sort of organize where these threats come from and what we're getting from each one of these. I do want to talk to you about sort of the, and then you obviously you have a big part of going forward. What are the strategies and tactics that we need to employ, and who needs to be employing those? But let's start with the first P, plutocrats. We've sort of touched on it a little bit, but expand on that.
Yeah, these are 5 Ps in a pod, if you like. And the first of those Ps, plutocrats. So these are the Elon Musks of the world. Elon Musk has, bought Twitter and weaponized it as a massive sort of producer and disseminator of misinformation and disinformation on climate, on COVID-19. It's become sort of a tool for these bad actors to spread their disinformation. Rupert Murdoch, another plutocrat who, of course, the News Corp, Fox News, Wall Street Journal editorial pages, his media empire is the largest media disseminator of misinformation and disinformation. By the way, Elon Musk's buyout of Twitter was leveraged by Saudi Arabia and Russia. Do you think that's a coincidence? It's not. Those are sort of two of the premier petrostates. They don't want climate action. They don't want us to move forward towards renewable energy. And they have weaponized social media using bot armies and troll farms to promote disinformation, to prevent, aimed at preventing any public action here. There are other plutocrats as well. Many of them fund this massive infrastructure, the Koch brothers we mentioned, who fund this sort of libertarian infrastructure, these various organizations, front groups, misinformation, disinformation websites that are all aimed at pumping misinformation and disinformation out into the public sphere that opposes science-based messaging on climate or on COVID-19 or anything that in any way threatens their libertarian vision of the world, their agenda.
I have to say, I had forgotten. I don't know why it had never occurred to me that Russia, and for that matter, Saudi Arabia, but in particular, Russia, wouldn't have the same incentive structure as the Koch brothers. The price of oil that Russia sells is intimately tied to the price of oil that the Koch brothers are going to sell. And
they are a petrostate, Sam. That is their largest asset.
Of course. It's just that, because it's Russia, it hadn't occurred to me that they would operate in the same way, that it would be more, to the extent that they want to destabilize things in the United States, it's not necessarily to no end. It is specifically they want to help the forces that will put more money in their pocket like anybody else. And
it's both. It's both. They want to do both of those things. So it's a twofer, if you like. And we talk about that in the book, destabilizing Western civilizations and enabling their business model at the same time.
And it depends on enclosure, right? I mean, just to stick on this for just a second, these are dinosaur companies, at least with the fossil fuels, that need to delay as they've been doing for decades, concealing this information for their business model to continue. But it also
the dinosaur analogy, by the way, is a good one, because we're literally talking about fossil fuels that were buried 100 million years ago or more, and they're bringing them to the surface to burn them. Yeah.
Right, and it just is amazing to me how quickly these financial forces were able to completely overtake our communications channels, and how easily an environment of full disinformation where nothing means anything or anything can mean anything abets a fascist project, because it creates such an advantage, or you can start the race so much earlier than everybody else who's catching up to the facts that would be relevant.
Yeah, well, Emma, I think you've brought us to the last of the P's, the press. And by that, we mean the media writ large. And obviously the conservative media, the Murdoch media empire, conservative news organizations that promote climate denialism, that promote anti-vax rhetoric. But also, we take aim in the book at the legacy media, the mainstream media, which is so guilty today of what we call performative neutrality, this idea that we have to elevate anti-science to the same level as the actual consensus of the world's scientists, balance in favor of accuracy. And, on the pages of the Washington Post and the New York Times, you will find that sort of misinformation, disinformation, or framing that is advantageous to these bad actors, whether it's the New York Times on Sunday. This was a few weeks ago, a day when we are supposed to be sort of we're embracing solar energy as part of the clean energy transition. And they published an op-ed about geoengineering. No, we don't have to reduce carbon emissions. We'll just pump particles into the stratosphere to block out the sun. What harm could possibly come from that? Ironically, yes, that's one way to try to cool down the Earth. It actually does block some of the sun, so it makes solar energy even less viable. On Sunday, they published that. And the Washington Post and the New York Times have platformed the lab leak theory on many occasions, the lab leak theory of COVID-19. Though there's no scientific evidence for it, there's no peer-reviewed literature behind it. The overwhelming evidence is in favor of zoonotic spillover, that bats and pangolins, these viruses are passed along through interactions between different species and ultimately to us. And so that's been a real problem. And the other thing, and Emma, I think you're referring to, you're underscoring this. A lot of our mainstream media are now actually being bought out by plutocrats. Every day, there's a new headline of what we used to think of as a mainstream media organization that is being bought out by a conservative plutocrat. What could possibly be the agenda? We know what the agenda is there. They don't care if they return a profit.
We know this with Amazon. We know this now with CBS and perhaps Time Warner, and Viacom with Ellison coming in, and Barry Weiss, who was the lead promoter of Jordan Peterson and Dave Rubin and the Weinstein brothers.
The Weinsteins, who are at the forefront of all of this, right? Where they have, I'm sorry to cut you off, Sam, but like this alternative media, I guess the way that they present themselves, but they are now in bed with like this plutocrat representative Barry Weiss, and like that it's this illusion of the democratization of information where it's actually even more insidious than it was 10 years ago.
Yeah, absolutely, Emma.
In terms of the P's, we covered also petrostates simultaneously following the plutocrat. What about the pros, as it were?
Yeah, and we'll combine the pros and the propagandists. These are the people who are down in the trenches, disseminating misinformation and disinformation, often making money from doing so, whether it's fossil fuel industry funded talking heads who are actually paid to promote their talking points in op-eds and on news programs, or as Peter has talked about quite a bit, these sort of public health influencers. There's a movement that the sort of now I'm forgetting the exact term that we use, but there's a health movement right now among conservatives that basically rejects the messaging and the wisdom of the public health community and turns to these alternative,
sort of Maha people.
The Maha, exactly. RFK Jr. is now the figurehead of that. He's the head of Health and Human Services. At the very top of our government, our policy now is run by, individuals who are tied to this this sort of fake health industry, and they make money by selling these miracle cures. And people won't buy their miracle cures if they believe in the efficacy of the conventional cures, vaccines, and masks, and all the other measures that the public health community has been promoting. And so they need to discredit the public health community to sell their product. And that's become an important part of the Maha movement. And when you still at those very press conferences, at that press conference where RFK Jr. was trying to blame vaccines and Tylenol for COVID-19, he was actually marketing
for autism.
For autism, blaming it for autism. He was actually he mentioned a product that is one of those miracle cure products that one of their friends is making a whole lot of money marketing.
I mean, you really only need to be on Instagram for like 10 minutes to get an example of what you're talking about. Like, and if they're not selling something at that moment, it takes about 60 to 90 days, maybe some number of their followers, whatever it is they're talking about.
Yeah.
Dementia, or or even like sleep apnea, or whatever it is, there is always like, the traditional medicine is not working in this way. Here are there's a study that shows that lysine is going to fix everything about you. And it just so happens that I sell lion's mane, which is also the key ingredient in this. And I don't know if the lion's mane's going to hurt you.
Some of these will. Some of these, chloroquine. Some of these actually, ivermectin can do real damage.
And I have no doubt that there's also, supplements out there. The magnesium helps you sleep, and that there are things that are good there. But it is very, very difficult to be a layperson and to assess this.
And to litigate the actual medical science here. And they take advantage of that. In an environment where there's massive misinformation, people don't know who to turn to. They turn to the charlatans. And I remember the term, it's the health freedom movement. And notice how freedom is there, right? Because it's trying to tap into sort of the ethos of today's conservative movement. They want to take away your freedom, whether it's, the hamburgers and the flights to see grandma, because of climate lockdowns, they're not going to let you out of your home anymore. They're actually using the same messaging when it came to COVID-19 because it fed that same sort of conspiratorial, these people want to take away your freedom. And so you're right. There's a very specific interest, these charlatans, that are making huge amounts of money off of these fake cures. But then at the same time, it's feeding this libertarian agenda of, that seeks to basically, that seeks to eradicate trusted messengers, that seeks to eradicate trust in expertise, because in that environment where misinformation and disinformation thrives, they win.
Well, it's anything, it seems to me, that is even remotely communitarian, right? Like science is not straightforwardly democratic, but there is like a peer review process. Yeah. And there is a sense of like the scientific community puts out, information, and science, of course, is also necessarily going to be used by governments to do things, and almost none of those things they do is going to be favorable to incumbent corporate powers. You may end up subsidizing, solar or and eventually they'll become the incumbent, and maybe it's then, I don't know, water or whatever it's going to be 100, 200 years from now. But that is why I think it has been just a long-term agenda item for conservatives, broadly speaking, to undermine science, because that type of objective reality ends up taking things out of the realm of a supposed religious informed morality. And that's basically the whole recipe.
Exactly. In an absence of fact-based discourse, again, their alternative facts and conspiracy theories get purchased. And that's what we're seeing today. I don't know, Emma and Sam, if either of you, I suspect neither of you are old enough. I grew up watching Carl Sagan, watching the Cosmos series, and you can still view it. And Sagan was sort of this great science philosopher and public figure of my generation when I was growing up. That my generation grew up with, and he would talk about sort of the self-correcting machinery of science and how important it is to our way of life. And there's a very haunting passage in his last book. It was published in 1997, the year he passed away. The demon-haunted world. Science as a Candle in the Dark. There's this passage, and you can go online and find it, where he has this premonition of a future, at the time of his grandchildren. Basically, right now, if you extrapolate, he's talking about now, where people become so unable to understand the science and technology that rules their lives, that they become hostage to. He really emphasized pseudoscience and misinformation of that sort. He was very worried about horoscopes and crystal healing and that sort of pseudoscience. I don't think he quite envisioned how anti-science would be weaponized, that corporate actors would actually weaponize that to advance their agenda. And so it's even worse than in some respects, than what Sagan presaged.
I am of a similar age to you, and you can find, I think Sagan was on with Charlie Rose when he really articulated
Yeah.
that fear. It is
Yeah.
eerie.
Yeah.
But I also have to say, I mean, and this is sort of my little bailiwick, is the blind spot to the corporate interests that were then championed by conservatives was there then.
Yeah.
And it was a blind spot because there was this sense that, like, well, we all go to the same country club,
We
or
care about democracy. We care about right.
and like the idea of like, well, you know, the theory, well, they have to live on this planet too, but the attitude I think that they have is like, well, that's why I have all the money to insulate me from the implications.
A naive assumption of good faith.
Yeah.
And that really was that was the weakness, as you say.
Let's talk about strategy and like what the response is. I mean, one of the conversations I am quite sure that we've had in the past was the disadvantage science, and I think it's the same thing with education. I came across the same sort of dynamic. When people want to attack education, when people want to attack science, it is people who are specifically propagandists, communicators who are coming into this space and going up against, let's say in the context of educators, like education is very sort of student oriented. It's very hard to have a broad ideology about education because it is so specific to who you're teaching at any given point. And in the battle of ideas, that's a disadvantage. And science is the same way. You rely on nuance. You rely on the idea of like, what is true is what is most provable at this time. That evolves over time. And science is a process, and it is not a sort of like a static thing. That's a really hard argument to make if the guy you're arguing against is just saying like, I don't think so. How come you guys don't agree with what you did 5 years ago?
Yeah, we're trying to build something. They're trying to tear it down. And there's a fundamental asymmetry there. That is the asymmetry that we're seeing writ large in our politics today. Yeah. And they just have to confuse. We need to educate. And science is tough to start with, right? I mean, and it's often laden in jargon, and scientists have to work very hard to be able to explain things in terms that are accessible to non-experts. That doesn't come naturally. And it's hard. But it's a whole lot harder if you're communicating against this massive headwind of a disinformation machine that is trying to confuse the public, that is trying, and they win, right? If they can confuse the public. And so their strategy is to throw so much mud on the wall that there's just no way that you, as the person who's trying to clarify this things, can scrape it all off. And so there's an asymmetry in this battle to begin with. Now you add the fact that they have the leading plutocrats of the world's wealthiest people funding their disinformation effort. And we've got a sort of a ragtag team of communicators and scientists who are in it because they're trying to do the right thing, not making a whole lot of money doing so. There are so many layers of asymmetry here. That's in the book. In the closing message is sort of, I borrow sort of, I wax Tolkien-esque. We wax Tolkien-esque because this is an epic battle for the future of humanity. And there's no guarantee that we win this battle, right? And as I say, no white wizard will come to our defense here to save the day. But we do have truth on our side, and the stakes couldn't be greater. So we have to fight this battle.
What are some of the, what is your message to scientists? And then let's talk about lay people in terms of dealing with this.
Yeah, I mean, my message, our message to scientists is that we have to be out there being willing to speak truth to power, to speak up. The other side is doing everything they can to silence us, to intimidate us. That's why they come after Peter. That's why they come after me. And we detail some of our numerous adventures in the crosshairs of the disinformation machine in the book. But that hasn't deterred us because we know that the stakes are so great. They're literally the future of human civilization as we know it. And so we ask scientists to be brave, to be willing to speak truth to power, to be willing to work together with organizations because alone we're very vulnerable. As individuals, we're vulnerable, but there's strength in numbers. And as we work together, as we team together and we work with scientific organizations and the scientific societies to try to push back against the misinformation, to push back against the disinformation, we can make some progress there. But here's the thing, and this is the larger message. There are lots of specific things we can do. We can try to, create more opportunities for young scientists who have a proclivity and interest in science communication to get engaged in that. We can try to work closely with opinion leaders, journalists, and others to form sort of an ecosystem for getting, actual scientific information out to the public and policymakers. But again, this is an asymmetric battle. There are overwhelming forces mounted against us. And in the end, if we don't change our politics, there isn't any obvious way forward. The most important thing that we can do is to participate in the political process. Because if we don't win back, our federal government for the side of science and fact-based discourse, our democracy is so fragile at this point. We are at such a vulnerable point right now that I fear that if we don't see people rise up, turn out in massive numbers in the midterm elections, where there's still maybe some time to steer this ship, if that doesn't happen, it's hard to see a way forward for the United States. And we see other Western nations also becoming vulnerable to some of these same, sort of authoritarian headwinds, tailwinds rather. We're seeing a movement towards authoritarianism in many other Western nations. And so, we are at a juncture, at a crossroads right now. And it's important that we recognize that. We recognize that we are in the midst of a, what is truly a battle, an existential battle for the future of humanity as we know it. And it's happening right now, as Sagan and others predicted.
Well, there's also the fact that this, we're talking, I think, about our democracy, and you are correctly talking about these threats to the United States, but we don't exist in the vacuum, obviously. I mean, we started the conversation with you speaking about some of these other incentives of who, invested in Twitter and that kind of thing. I mean, where does China play into all of this? Because China seems to be outpacing the United States technologically quite rapidly, and it is both. It's just maddening to see because you have disinformation like weighing down progress in this country like ankle weights, and it's just talk a little bit about China and that competition and the role that plays.
Yeah, thanks so much for that question, Emma. There's a line that, again, that we borrow from Lord of the Rings. Our list of allies grows thin. Those of us fighting back against these forces, our list of allies grows thin. And so we look for who are the allies here. And sometimes they may come from sort of unexpected places, right? China is an ally when it comes to the battle for a livable planet. They are now leading the world. In the absence, with the United States now having become a petro state itself, our policies right now are dictated by the fossil fuel industry. That really leaves only China as sort of a superpower that is actually prioritizing environmental health and the climate crisis. And they're doing that in a number of ways. They're actually taking actions. President Xi actually, in his response to Trump's climate denial speech at the UN General Assembly, Xi responded to that, not by name, but basically saying, we don't care if the United States is falling into sort of denial and opposition to action, adopting an agenda of inaction, we will still lead, and we will lead by reducing our own emissions. And keep in mind, China doesn't have a legacy of 2 centuries of fossil fuel burning, and so arguably, they can rightly say we should get our turn too. So for them to reduce their carbon emissions is far more aggressive an action on their part than for the United States, which has 2 centuries of doing this. And they are reducing their carbon emissions. They're taking leadership there, and they're providing clean energy infrastructure, renewable energy, solar panels, electric vehicles to the rest of the world. They're reducing global carbon emissions by doing that.
That's also, I mean, they have the capacity to have a 10, 20, 30-year vision. And in 30 years, I mean, 30 or 40 years, regardless of what scenarios play out, the world is going to be significantly more solar powered and significantly more electric vehicle powered than it is today. And the question is, who's going to capture all of that, that manufacturing behind that and that technology? And China is like somehow has leapt ahead of us. They seem like they're now like 10 years, 15 years ahead of us on that.
Yeah,
they have EVs that go 400 miles and cost 20 grand. It is, it's, I mean, and I only bring that up in the sense that like it almost like speaks to the lie of even the nationalism that that is being promoted by these same science the deniers. Because if you were genuinely interested in the American project, you would look to what China's doing in terms of EVs instead of cutting subsidies
100%
to this in 3 months.
But absolutely. Yeah. Well, I'll just say that,
I want to ask you though, is there a move in academics? Like obviously, like I couldn't agree more in terms of the political situation and the urgency and immediacy of that.
Yeah.
I wonder if in the context of the scientific community, particularly on the university level, is there an awareness that like, this happened in the 80s, I guess in the 80s and the 90s, like business schools said like, we're going to have an ethics class, and because they were realizing what was going on, it didn't seem to work that well. But is there a move within the context of the scientific community to say part of our job now, to the extent, because I maybe this is my own sort of like bias, but scientists aren't necessarily, the most sort of like necessarily the most communicative, and that's not where their skill set lies.
Try not to be insulted, Sam, but I agree with you.
Present company accepted.
We're not trained that. We're not trained to do that,
and you're not self-selecting for those attributes. Exactly. I mean, if I actually had to work, as opposed to just talk for a job, then I would be, I would have gone and done it. But
absolutely.
But is there any effort to, I don't know, either create a new discipline within the context of like science departments, or, you're on the science communication tract, or just broadly speaking, some, training for how you, I don't know, apply for grants, in the face of a system that is stacked against. I mean, like there's capitalism in scientific grants as well. I mean, what's the answer on that?
Yeah, thanks for asking. And I'll say I was for 9 months I'd taken up a new position at Penn. I was a university administrator. I was the vice provost for climate science policy and action, and I stepped down a couple weeks ago, because I felt in this moment I couldn't be a university administrator. We have a policy, the university has a policy of neutrality on controversial topics. I had to be out there speaking truth to power at this moment. And so I stepped down from that position, from that administrative position. I still direct a center here at Penn. I'm still a professor here at Penn, but I'm not a university administrator. And I feel it frees me up to talk about these things, because we have to be able to be out there talking about this. And as you say, do we need a new sort of, area of sort of academic inquiry, science communication? I think so. I think communication is a field, and I think increasingly there's a lot of support and interest in sort of science communication as an academic discipline. And our center here at Penn, which is partly it's in the School of Arts and Sciences, and it's also partly in the Annenberg School for Communication. And our center actually works towards the science of science communication. How can we be more effective? How can we provide more opportunities? And again, we need to not tell every scientist that they should be out there, speaking to the public, because you put your finger on it. A lot of them shouldn't be out there speaking to the public. Their talents lie best in them being in the laboratory doing the science that they do. But for those scientists, and there are, who have a proclivity for communicating, who have an interest and a passion for doing so, we've got to provide the opportunities, we've got to provide the training. And that's what our center does here at Penn. That there are a lot of other sort of similar centers and institutes around the country that recognize that we need at least some set of the scientific community to be properly trained and equipped to be out there, speaking to the public and policymakers, because as I've often said, if we're not out there, we leave a vacuum, and we know whom that vacuum is going to be filled with. It's going to be filled with the disinformation specialists, the bad actors. And that's where we are right now. We're late in the game, right? So we can't wait to train a whole new generation of scientists to do battle against disinformation and misinformation. It'll be too late. So we got to go to battle with, if you will, to quote a public figure from some decades ago with the army, with the army that we have. That's where we are right now.
Yeah, I mean, I wonder too if ultimately, as this, hopefully we have the opportunity for this type of movement to mature, which I do think is like, we're in a very, very tentative period of time. But ultimately, I mean, if we look at who for lack of a better term, enemies of science are, they have been the huge money interests who are making money off of stuff that is harming the planet. It is, whose interests are against the idea of government regulation, broadly speaking, right? Broadly speaking, because government regulation, broadly speaking, inhibits corporate power. That's largely what it does. Right. And also the idea that like sort of the wellness industry is so huge right now, and it is driven by a series of like many, many, many hundreds, if not thousands, maybe millions of sort of wellness entrepreneurs who all sort of plug into this. It's also a function, it seems to me, of both a lack of regulation and a sort of a level of desperation that comes with a government that has not addressed sort of the economic well-being of people. Like if if your choice out there is to believe that like this substance is going to, cure people's cancer, and you could stop your medications, and it's a combination of salt water and also just the commodity that I sell, then you're going to do it.
Cheap. They're very cheap, and so they can make a lot of money, and it goes along with consultations, which they charge huge amounts for. And so you're right, there's an immense amount of money that's being made here, and it is a product of the deregulatory sort of environment that was created by conservatives and libertarian activists decades ago. They were working, the health freedom movement was spurred onward by libertarian activists because they want to get rid of regulation, whether it's for public health, whether it's for fossil fuels or anything else. And that's why we're, in the tight spot that we're in right now. So in the book, we talk about, it's obviously important to restore common sense regulations. We need to be regulating social media companies that have allowed misinformation and disinformation.
How would you do that?
So there are models for that. Other countries like Australia, for example, are doing that. They do have, like Canada, they do actually have laws that sort of rein in. We used to have the fairness doctrine, right?
Yep.
Which mandated that media outlets present information in a balanced and accurate way. One of the first things that Ronald Reagan did was to get rid of his FCC, got rid of that. And so there was once an infrastructure for doing that. It's been dismantled. We have to rebuild it. And again, it comes down to, how do we do any of that? We can't do any of that if we don't restore some semblance of sanity to our federal government, if we don't elect representatives at all levels, all the way up to president, that will represent our interests rather than be rubber stamps for the bad actors that currently run the show. And that's where we are right now. In a year, we're going to have a midterm election, which will determine whether we are able to right this ship. And people should be doing everything they possibly can to motivate everybody they know to participate in that election, because it really is an election that will determine the future of our democracy and possibly the future of human civilization.
I couldn't agree more. And one final question: are there social movements out there, like electoral politics? Obviously, like, it's an urgent period of time. There's no guarantee there's going to be an election in 2026. It's not something I would have said maybe 4 months ago, but the pace in which these things are going, it almost seems harder to imagine that Trump won't say, like, well, we need 30 days before we have this election, whatever it is.
I have that same fear.
Redistricting, whatnot.
Yep.
The only other backstop we have, and these are not mutually exclusive things. In fact, I would argue that they are absolutely necessary for each other, are social movements and structures that exist where people organize around at the moment. Like,
and they're trying to push back against that as well, as you know. That's all of this Antifa. They want to intimidate anybody who would think to speak out, anybody who would organize and protest. That's what they're doing right now.
Yep. Do you see unions as, do you see like other organizations that are structured around fighting corporate power, which is largely, what we're talking about here, as being important to this fight?
Yeah, I mean, there's a civic infrastructure in this country. You can be involved, various groups, non-governmental organizations that are working towards change, and recognizing, and this is an important, it's easy to become very depressed here, given what's happening in the United States. But as I remind people, all the United States gets to determine here is what it is going to do moving forward. China, the European countries, Australia, the rest of the world is moving forward with science-based policies, and they're the ones who are going to prosper. China, Europe, they are going to prosper as they pursue sort of science and technology and where it's leading us. If we turn our back on science and technology, which was ultimately this country was built on it, if we turn our back on that, as you alluded to earlier in the conversation, we're going to fall behind the rest of the world. And so I'm pretty confident that the world will move forward, that we will get off fossil fuels, we'll move towards renewable energy. We're already doing that. We're already seeing that happen. All the United States gets to determine at this point is, will it be part of the solution or will it be part of the problem? And if it's the latter, then the other countries of the world are going to have a really tough conversation about what to be done about the bad state actors, Russia, Saudi Arabia. And do we want to be in that group?
Dr. Michael Mann, climatologist, a geophysicist, director of the Center for Science, Sustainability, and the Media at the University of Pennsylvania. The book is Science Under Siege: How to Fight the 5 Most Powerful Forces That Threaten Our World, written with Dr. Peter Hotez. Please give him our our thanks for the work that he's been doing as well. Really appreciate you coming on today. We'll put a link to that book at majority.fm and the podcast and YouTube description.
Thank you. It was a pleasure talking with both of you. Hope to come back again soon. So thanks so much.
Thanks.
Likewise.
Hey, folks, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and check out our daily show. We do it every day at 12 p.m. Eastern for about 2.5 hours. We even take phone calls. You should check that out.